They told her she was digging her own grave. In a way, they were right, except it turned out to be everyone else's salvation. Montana Territory, autumn of 1887. The first time Clara Whitmore struck her pickaxe into the hillside behind the abandoned mining claim, her neighbor, Samuel Garrett, rode up on his horse and sat watching her for a full 10 minutes before speaking. "You know there's no gold in that hill," he finally said. "The prospectors checked it years ago. Nothing but clay and rock." Clara didn't stop swinging. "I'm not looking for gold." "Then what are you doing?" "Building a home." Garrett laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that made Clara's golden retriever, Copper, raise his head and growl softly. "A home? In a hill? Ma'am, with respect, your husband left you that cabin not 200 yards from here. It's got 4 walls, a roof, and a fireplace. What more does a woman need?" Clara paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at Garrett with eyes that had seen too much to care about the opinions of men who had seen too little. "My husband is dead, Mr. Garrett. The cabin he built has walls so thin I can hear the wind laughing at me through every crack. Last winter, I burned every stick of furniture we owned just to keep from freezing, and I still woke up with ice in my hair. This winter, I'm going to sleep warm, and I'm going to do it underground, where the cold can't reach me." Garrett shook his head slowly, the way men do when they've decided a woman has lost her mind and there's no point arguing. "Suit yourself, Mrs. Whitmore, but when that tunnel collapses on your head, don't expect anyone to dig you out." He rode away without looking back. Clara returned to her work. The pickaxe rose and fell. The hill slowly opened, and Copper sat watching, his tail brushing the autumn leaves, waiting for his human to build them a place where winter couldn't follow. Thomas Whitmore had died in April, 3 days after the spring thaw revealed his body at the bottom of the ravine where he'd fallen while checking trap lines in February. The search parties had given up after 2 weeks. The snow had been too deep, the terrain too treacherous, the odds too long. Clara had known he was dead by the end of the first week, had felt it in her bones the way you feel a change in the weather. But she'd kept a candle burning in the window until the melt came, and the truth came with it. The funeral had been brief. The sympathy had been briefer. By May, the townspeople had moved on to other concerns, and Clara had been left alone with a cabin that leaked, a dog that mourned, and a piece of land that nobody wanted because it was too far from water and too close to the mountains where the worst weather bred. She could have sold the claim and moved to town. She could have found work as a seamstress or a cook or a laundress, could have traded her independence for the security of walls that someone else maintained. The respectable widows did this. The sensible widows did this. Clara was tired of being sensible. She had grown up in a mining family in Cornwall, England, where her father and brothers had spent their lives crawling through tunnels carved into the earth. She had heard their stories around the dinner table, stories of underground chambers that stayed the same temperature year-round, cool in summer and warm in winter, protected from storms that raged helplessly above. She had visited the old mines herself as a girl, had felt the strange comfort of being wrapped in earth, and had never forgotten the lesson. The surface world was hostile, unpredictable, deadly. But the underground world was stable. The underground world was safe. Her husband had called it foolishness when she'd suggested building a root cellar their first year on the claim. "We're not moles," he'd said, laughing. "We're people. People live above ground." Thomas had been a good man, but he had been wrong about many things, including, apparently, how to navigate a snow-covered ravine in February. Clara had spent the summer preparing. She'd studied the hillside, looking for the right combination of soil stability, drainage, and orientation. She'd read every book about mining and excavation that the Territorial Library possessed, all 3 of them. She'd talked to old prospectors in town, buying them drinks in exchange for advice about shoring and ventilation and the secrets of keeping a tunnel from becoming a tomb. And when the leaves began to turn, she'd started digging. The work was harder than she'd imagined, harder than the stories had made it sound, harder than the books had described, harder than anything she'd done in her 31 years of living. The first 3 feet were the worst. The topsoil was rocky and root-tangled, fighting her pickaxe with every swing. She found stones the size of her head buried just beneath the surface, each one requiring an hour of prying and levering to remove. Her hands blistered, then bled, then blistered again over the wounds. Her shoulders screamed. Her back threatened to give out entirely. But she kept going. By the end of the first week, she had carved a horizontal gash into the hillside about 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The neighbors had started to notice. They rode by more frequently than before, finding excuses to check on her, really coming to witness the spectacle of the crazy widow digging herself into a mountain. "It'll flood," predicted Martha Olson, who lived 3 miles east and considered herself an expert on everything. "The spring snowmelt will fill that hole like a bathtub and drown everything inside." "The roof will cave in," warned her husband Henrik. "Earth isn't meant to hang over empty space. God made ceilings out of wood and stone, not dirt." "She'll hit rock and have to give up," said young Billy Tanner, who worked as a hand on the Garrett Ranch. "My pa tried to dig a well once and hit granite at 8 feet. Broke 2 pickaxes and gave up." Clara listened to all of them. She thanked them for their concern, and she kept digging. The second week brought different earth, dense clay that held its shape when she carved it, that didn't crumble or collapse, that smelled of ancient dampness and quiet patience. This was what she'd been hoping for. Clay was a tunnel builder's friend. It compressed under its own weight instead of falling, and it sealed against water better than any mortar. She began to shape the space more carefully now, not just excavating, but designing. The entrance tunnel she kept narrow, just wide enough for her shoulders, angled slightly upward from outside to inside, so water would drain out rather than pooling in. The main chamber she started to widen, carving an oval space that would eventually be 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at the center. The shoring came next. She'd traded 3 months of butter and eggs to the sawmill owner for a stack of pine logs, and she spent 4 days cutting them to length and fitting them into place. Vertical posts every 4 feet along the walls, horizontal beams across the ceiling, notched to lock into the posts. The frame created a skeleton that would hold even if the earth decided to settle. The work required precision she hadn't known she possessed. Each beam had to be cut to exactly the right length. Too short, and it wouldn't support anything. Too long, and it wouldn't fit into place. She learned to measure twice and cut once, to test fit every piece before committing to the final position. She learned the sound of wood under stress, the creak that meant a beam was bearing weight properly, and the groan that meant something was about to fail. She made mistakes. Of course, she made mistakes. She was learning as she went, teaching herself a trade that men spent years apprenticing to master. One of her early ceiling beams split along a hidden crack, dropping 6 inches before the neighboring beams caught the load. She replaced it the same day. working until her arms shook and her vision blurred, because a single weak point could bring down everything she'd built. But she learned from every mistake, and she didn't make the same one twice. Between the logs, she packed more clay, mixed with straw from the barn. This mixture, she'd learned about it from a book about ancient buildings, would dry into a surface almost as hard as brick, stabilizing the walls and creating a smooth interior that would be easy to keep clean. By the third week, she had a tunnel. October brought the first frost, and with it, a change in the town's attention. The Garrett Ranch lost 2 calves to an early cold snap, the animals freezing overnight in a pasture that should have been safe for another month. The Olson farm discovered their root cellar had flooded, rotting half their winter vegetable stores. Young Billy Tanner's father, still working on that well, struck water at last. But the water was brackish and undrinkable, contaminated by some underground mineral deposit that nobody had known existed. Meanwhile, Clara's tunnel remained dry, stable, and increasingly habitable. She had finished the main chamber and started on the fireplace, a stone structure built against the back wall, with a chimney that rose through the earth at an angle until it emerged from the hillside 20 feet above. The design was based on the old Cornish mine ventilation systems. The angled chimney would draw smoke out while preventing rain and snow from falling in. The fireplace itself was small, barely 2 feet wide, but in an enclosed underground space, even a small fire would generate more than enough heat. The townspeople stopped laughing and started watching. Samuel Garrett came by again in late October, this time without the smirk. He stood at the entrance of the tunnel. She'd framed it with timber now, a proper doorway with a heavy oak door she'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead, and peered into the darkness within. "Can I see inside?" Clara handed him a lantern. "Mind your head at the entrance. It opens up once you're past the first few feet." He ducked through the doorway and disappeared. For a long moment, there was silence. Then his voice echoed back, muffled by earth. "Good Lord." When he emerged, his expression had changed entirely. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "It's warm in there. Must be 15, 20 degrees warmer than out here." 55 degrees, Clara said. "The Earth maintains that temperature year-round at this depth. Cooler than a summer day, warmer than a winter night. It's physics, Mr. Garrett, not magic. You built a fireplace, underground. The chimney vents through the hillside. The smoke rises naturally. The angle prevents backdrafts. I could show you the diagrams if you're interested." Garrett stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Mrs. Whitmore, I owe you an apology. When you started this project, I thought..." "You thought I was crazy. You weren't alone." "I thought you were crazy," he admitted. "I was wrong. This is something else entirely." He rode away slowly, looking back twice before disappearing around the bend in the trail. Clara permitted herself a small smile. Then she went back inside to finish installing the wooden bed frame she'd been working on. November brought snow, and the snow brought visitors. First came Martha Olson, her earlier skepticism forgotten, asking if Clara might share the plans for her ventilation system. The Olson farmhouse chimney had collapsed under the weight of wet snow, and they were trying to rebuild before the real cold set in. Then came Henrik Olson, hat in hand, asking if Clara might be willing to sell some of her stockpiled firewood. Their own supply had gotten wet when the woodshed roof leaked, and wet wood burned poorly if it burned at all. Then came others, families from town who had heard about the underground shelter and wanted to see it for themselves. Clara gave tours when she had time, explaining the principles of earth insulation and thermal mass to anyone who would listen. Most nodded politely and left confused. A few asked intelligent questions and stayed to learn. Through it all, she continued improving her home. She laid plank flooring over packed earth, creating a clean surface that would be easy to sweep. She built shelves into the walls for storage. She hung bundles of pine branches from the ceiling beams, partly for the fresh scent, partly because the resin was mildly antiseptic and would help keep the air clean. She wove rugs from scraps of fabric and placed them strategically around the chamber, adding color and warmth to the earthen space. Copper had claimed his spot immediately, a worn blanket beside the fireplace, where he could watch both the flames and the tunnel entrance. He seemed to understand, in the way that dogs sometimes understand, that this place was special, that his human had built them something important. By December, the shelter was complete. Clara moved in on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and slept more peacefully than she had since Thomas died. The blizzard came on January 7, 1888. It would later be called the schoolhouse blizzard, the children's blizzard, the storm that changed everything. It would kill hundreds of people across the Northern Territories, many of them children caught between school and home when the weather turned. It would freeze cattle in pastures, and travelers on roads, and families in houses that couldn't hold back the cold. Clara experienced none of this directly. She experienced it as sound, a howling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a freight train roar that went on for hours and then days. She experienced it as pressure, the feeling of being wrapped in cotton while the world outside tried to tear itself apart. She experienced it as warmth, steady and unchanging, while her thermometer showed the temperature outside plunging to 40 below zero. She had supplies for a month. She had firewood stacked against one wall, seasoned pine and oak that burned clean and hot. She had water from a spring she'd tapped at the back of the chamber, where groundwater seeped through a crack in the rock and collected in a basin she'd carved for it. She had food, preserved meat and vegetables, dried beans and flour, salt and sugar and coffee. She had her dog, her blankets, her books, and absolutely no reason to venture outside until the storm passed. So she didn't. She read by lantern light while the world ended above her. She cooked simple meals on the grate she'd installed over her fire pit. She talked to Copper about everything and nothing, the sound of her own voice a comfort against the howling that never stopped. She slept and woke and slept again, losing track of time in the unchanging lamplight of her underground world. On the third morning, she thought it was morning, she heard something that wasn't wind, pounding, at her door. She grabbed the rifle Thomas had left her and approached cautiously. "Who's there? Please." A voice, thin and desperate, barely audible through the oak. "Please, we saw the smoke from your chimney. Please let us in." Clara opened the door onto a nightmare. 3 figures stood in the tunnel entrance, so covered in snow and ice that they barely looked human. 2 adults, she recognized them as the Hendersons, a family who lived 4 miles north, and a child, maybe 6 or 7, clutched between them. Behind them, the world was white, a wall of blowing snow so dense that Clara couldn't see more than 5 feet past her doorframe. "Get inside. Now." They stumbled through, and she slammed the door against the wind that tried to follow them. The temperature in the chamber dropped 10 degrees in the seconds the door was open. She could feel the cold trying to push its way in, a living force that wanted what she had. The Hendersons collapsed on her floor, shaking so violently they couldn't speak. The child, Their daughter Emma was silent and still, and for a terrible moment Clara thought she was dead. Then the girl's eyes opened, focusing slowly on the fire, and she made a sound that was half sob and half moan. Alive. They were all alive. Clara worked quickly. Blankets first, then hot water from the kettle she kept simmering, then warm broth spooned into mouths too cold to chew solid food. She stripped off their frozen outer clothes and replaced them with dry blankets, with quilts, with anything that would hold heat against skin that had nearly forgotten what warmth felt like. It took 6 hours before any of them could talk properly. "Our house," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice raw from cold and tears. The wind took the roof, just peeled it off like paper. The walls started falling after that. We had to run. "We saw your smoke," Mr. Henderson added. His fingers were white, the early stages of frostbite, but Clara thought they might recover if she kept them warm and elevated. "We didn't know where else to go. Everyone else is too far. We never would have made it." "How did you know about this place?" "Everyone knows about the crazy widow who dug herself into a mountain." He tried to smile, but the expression faltered. "Doesn't seem so crazy now." Clara looked at her small shelter, now crowded with 3 extra bodies and the accumulated terror of a night spent running through the apocalypse. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't." The Hendersons were the first, but not the last. Over the next 2 days, while the storm continued to rage, 5 more people found their way to Clara's door. Young Billy Tanner, separated from a search party looking for lost cattle. An old prospector named Jenkins, who had been caught out in the open and followed the smoke signal of Clara's chimney for 2 miles through whiteout conditions. A woman named Sarah Cross and her infant son, refugees from a farmhouse that had become a freezing death trap when the fire went out and wouldn't relight. Clara's shelter, designed for 1 woman and her dog, held 9 people by the time the storm finally broke. They slept in shifts, 3 or 4 at a time on the bed and floor, while others sat against the walls. They rationed food carefully, stretching Clara's supplies to feed everyone. They kept the fire burning constantly, the small chamber staying warm despite the impossible cold outside. They talked and prayed and told stories to keep the fear at bay. Little Emma Henderson stopped shaking by the 2nd day, though she refused to let go of her mother's hand for even a moment. Billy Tanner, who was only 19 and had never been close to death before, wept quietly in the corner when he thought no one was looking. The old prospector Jenkins told tales of winters he'd survived in the mountains, each story more harrowing than the last, though Clara suspected he was exaggerating to give the others something to focus on besides their fear. Sarah Cross nursed her infant son in the warmest corner, near the fireplace, singing softly to him in a language Clara didn't recognize. The baby, his name was Michael, seemed oblivious to the catastrophe, sleeping and eating and crying with the uncomplicated demands of a creature too young to understand that the world had nearly ended around him. Clara found herself thinking of Thomas during those long hours, wondering if he had been afraid when he fell, if he had known what was happening, if he had thought of her in those final moments. She hoped the end had been quick. She hoped he hadn't suffered the way these people had suffered, struggling through miles of killing cold with death whispering at their backs. She hoped, wherever he was, he could see what she had built, what she had become, and they survived. When the wind finally stopped on the morning of January 10th, Clara opened her door onto a world transformed. The snow was drifted 15 feet high in places, sculpted into alien shapes by wind that had blown without pause for 3 days. The sky was clear and blue, almost obscenely cheerful after the darkness of the blizzard. The temperature had risen to merely bitter, 10 below zero, practically balmy compared to the depths of the storm. One by one, her refugees emerged, blinking in the sunlight like creatures from another world. "My God," whispered Mr. Henderson, looking at the buried landscape. "How did anyone survive this?" Many hadn't. Over the following weeks, as the community dug itself out and took stock of the damage, the death toll mounted. Frozen bodies found in snowdrifts, collapsed houses with families still inside, children who had tried to walk home from school and never arrived. The blizzard had killed more than 300 people across the territories, and the number might have been higher, if not for the random miracles that had saved some and condemned others. Clara's shelter was one of those miracles. The story spread quickly. The widow Whitmore, who had dug herself into a hillside while everyone laughed, had saved 9 lives during the worst storm in living memory. The newspapers picked it up. The territorial governor mentioned it in a speech about preparedness and pioneer resilience. Strangers started showing up at Clara's claim, wanting to see the underground shelter that had become famous. She turned most of them away, but she welcomed the ones who came to learn. That spring, Clara taught her first class in earth-sheltered construction. 17 students showed up: farmers, ranchers, townspeople who had lost homes or loved ones in the blizzard and were determined never to be that vulnerable again. Clara showed them everything: how to choose a site, how to evaluate soil stability, how to dig and shore and ventilate and waterproof. She demonstrated the fireplace design that kept her smoke flowing out and the warmth flowing in. She explained the physics of thermal mass and the engineering of underground drainage. By autumn, there were 8 new underground shelters in the valley. By the following spring, there were 20. Within 5 years, the technique had spread across the northern territories, adapted and modified for different soils and climates, but always based on the same principles Clara had learned from her father's stories and refined through her own desperate necessity. Some builders improved on her design. A Swedish immigrant named Lindqvist developed a better ventilation system that prevented moisture buildup in humid conditions. A former military engineer created standardized plans that even inexperienced builders could follow. A group of Blackfeet craftsmen combined Clara's underground principles with their own traditional knowledge, creating hybrid structures that were better suited to the specific conditions of their homeland. Clara welcomed all of it. She visited the new shelters when she could, offering advice and encouragement, learning from the innovations that others had made. She collected the improvements and incorporated them into her teaching, so that each new student benefited from the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had come before. "Knowledge isn't like gold," she told her students. "Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Every person who learns from me and teaches someone else makes the whole community stronger." She never charged for the teaching. She accepted donations when people offered firewood, food, labor on projects she couldn't complete alone, but the knowledge itself she gave away freely. It seemed wrong to profit from survival, wrong to put a price on something that might mean the difference between life and death for someone else's family. "You could be rich," Samuel Garrett told her once, years later, when the underground shelters had become a common feature of the landscape and Clara's name was known throughout the territory. "You could have patented the design, charged licensing fees, built an empire." Clara was sitting at the entrance of her shelter, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold while Copper, old now, gray around the muzzle, but still loyal, dozed at her feet. "I'm already rich," she said. "I have a home that keeps me warm. I have work that matters. I have a dog who loves me and neighbors who respect me. What else does a woman need? Garrett had no answer for that. Clara Whitmore lived in her underground shelter for another 37 years, until her death in the winter of 1924 at the age of 68. She died in her sleep, in the bed she had built with her own hands, in the room she had carved from a hillside, while everyone told her she was crazy. Copper had died years before, had been buried in a small grave at the top of the hill, where the chimney smoke rose and dispersed into the mountain air. Clara had gotten other dogs since, had loved them and lost them and loved them again. But Copper had been special. Copper had been there at the beginning, had watched her dig the first shovelful of dirt, had been the first to sleep warm in the shelter that would save so many lives. She was buried beside him, at her own request. The grave marker was simple: Clara Whitmore, 1856-1924. She dug deep and found warmth. The shelter still stands today, maintained by the Historical Society as an example of pioneer ingenuity. Visitors can walk through the entrance tunnel, duck through the timber-frame doorway, and stand in the oval chamber where 9 people survived the worst blizzard in territorial history. The fireplace still works. The spring still seeps through its crack in the rock. The earthen walls still hold the steady 55-degree temperature that Clara discovered more than a century ago. The guides tell her story to every group that passes through. They explain the physics and the engineering, the history and the tragedy. The woman who was mocked for digging a hole and ended up saving a community. But the part of the story that resonates most, the part that visitors remember long after they've forgotten the technical details, is simpler than physics or engineering. It's about a woman who lost everything and decided to build something new. A woman who faced an impossible winter and carved out a space where impossible didn't apply. A woman who listened to her own wisdom when everyone else's wisdom had failed. They told her she was digging her own grave. They told her she was crazy, foolish, wasting her time on a fantasy that would collapse around her. She kept digging anyway. And when the storm came, the storm that killed hundreds, that buried houses and froze cattle and turned the prairie into a frozen hell, she was warm. She was safe. She was alive. And so were the 9 people who found their way to her door, drawn by the smoke from a chimney that rose from a hillside, the only sign of life in a world that had surrendered to the cold. Some lessons take a long time to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But Clara knew. Clara had always known. The surface world is hostile, unpredictable, deadly. But dig deep enough and you find something else. You find warmth. You find shelter. You find home. All you have to do is keep swinging.